builds a house, nobody can tear it down. If the Lord builds a house, nobody can tear it down. When it's built on His name, there's nothing gonna shake this ground. If the Lord builds a house, nobody can tear it down.
I know it's strange not having a scripture reading, and also you might also be finding it strange that we did not pass the peace, but that is a part of our kind of desire to work on forming this service in a way that will reflect, if you want to know some of the thinking here, that will reflect the way we need it to be when we move into a building and share space with others, right? There's some space sharing sometimes. We won't have the luxuries of, Michelle's sermon went long, we're gonna, that kind of thing. So we want to just play around and see until we feel like the service is the way it is. But you will pass the piece later, I promise. So during renewal leave, I went on a trip to England with my best friend from seminary, Rachel. And we are, moms of 3-year-olds, so we were like, we can't leave our family for 14 days and go on these guided tours. And so we made our own tour. And we went on this 6-day pilgrimage through the main Methodist sites. It was amazing. But there was one thing that had nothing to do with Methodism, not really, that I had to see. And I knew that I had to make sure that it was woven into this. And you all have, I promise you, how many of you have been to London before? Okay, I figured a good portion of the room. That was my first time. I had been to Europe many times. My husband, I hadn't been to Europe actually at all until I met Chris, because his family lives in Belgium. And so we now had an excuse to go all the time. But I had never been to England until this trip. But I bet many of you have seen this and you didn't know you have seen it. In Trafalgar Square, there is a church in the far right corner. There are lots of other things that you're probably paying attention to and taking pictures and all that, but there's a church in the far right corner, and we'll put it up here. St. Martin in the Fields Anglican Church. It was a thing on my list. Sorry, I need to wipe my glasses. It was a thing on my list and that I had to see. And let me tell you a little bit of why that is. Smack dab in Trafalgar Square, we attended the 5 p.m. evensong service that day. And the reason I wanted to go, which was not to go to the evensong service, was because of this church's prominent positioning in my mind, in my kind of missional outlook on the world. Something that this church has done, and that I learned about in seminary, and that I have continued to study. And the way I think I even am in ministry here, St. Martin in the Fields was almost one of the first to be thinking in that direction. Also, probably my favorite theologian still living today. I'll put a little picture up here for a second. He doesn't matter as much, but for a second you can see him. Sam Wells, my favorite living theologian, happens to be the pastor of this church, but he now preaches there maybe once every 8 weeks or something as he's coming in and out of town. I would say St. Martin's in the Field would like to be a normal church. I think for a period of time they functioned as a normal church. Normal church, being good at loving your neighbor, yes, but also, being good at tending to the things like worship and the cycle, if you're an Anglican, all the high church stuff and the cycle of the Christian year and really beautiful choirs and all of that thing. There would like to be a normal church, but they realized that where they were placed in the community made it so that they could not be a normal church. They weren't a normal church. They were the church in the profile of Trafalgar Square, and in this growing metropolis with all kinds of multi-ethnic faith just surrounding them every given day, which caused them to reevaluate how they might be a blessing to this community. This was back in the 90s, but they were one of the first to do it. How to be a blessing to both the tourists that would be coming through, millions of tourists every day, but also how to be this great blessing among this multi-ethnic patchwork of London. And it was out of this reimagining that a kind of movement began. And this movement was actually called Heart Edge, because they believed that the church should strike straight to the heart and go all the way to the edge. Heart Edge, it became this community that emerged out of this, a movement that has formed me as a pastor, and I've read so many books about it. Heart Edge is this movement that seeks the renewal of the church by catalyzing kingdom communities. It aims for the church to be a space that fosters instead of imposes. That was not the way the church was not long ago. A space that fosters rather than imposes. We don't use those words here, but I think we do that. It sees the kingdom as God's gift to renew the church, not a mission to be conformed to the church's image. See the difference in those two things? But for so long, the kingdom has always been the mission to the people for them to be conformed to the likeness of the church. And it sees also churches as as they are, and this is the part that's particularly very relevant today, but the churches as lively, dynamic communities exactly as they currently are, with the exact people and the exact gifts and the exact graces they already have, rather than churches being some form of defensive, always trying to build to be the thing that they are kind of congregations. And always feeling in defense of our people and our space and our growth and all of that. And so I'll tell you, this is the first I had ever heard of this kind of talk of the church, knowing very well that all the other way of talking about it wasn't right, but we just didn't have a new way to talk about it. And so through Heart Edge, communities in the UK, they mentor each other. Gosh, I wish we had this in the US. Communities, faith communities in the UK mentor each other, offer consultancy days with one another, where churches gather and they point out in each other their greatest gifts. They meet in large gatherings to exchange ideas together, encourage each other, and challenge each other for being a church in this particular time. It seeks not to create clones of St. Martin's in the field, but to become this kind of international beacon of hope, committed to the vision of the church at the heart and on the edge of communities. Reimagining, church and society. And so, of course, they decide to think about it in 4 different ways. And we know congregational life. So this Heart Edge thinks that we are reimagining communities and reimagining society and reimagining the church through congregational life, the normal things we do, Sunday morning worship and all of that. That's easy to know what that means. Also through culture. They realize that Anglican churches, for instance, have a gift that most churches do not have, which they normally have gorgeous choirs that do evensong, evensong are these services where the choir sings everything from beginning to end, the scripture, the prayers, everything. That's very unique, and so instead of saying we needed to become a contemporary version that people can palate, which is most of the time what churches do, they said we are going to own what we do. And we're going to be this hub for culture in our community, making the church the kind of estuary where creative energies emerge and people who want to be a part of community choirs are formed and gathered. Then through commerce, and the declining, you think the church is in decline in the US, the church is in crazy decline in Europe. You are It's hard to find a pastor on a Sunday morning, actually. I learned that when I was I tried to go to Advent 1, the first Sunday of Advent in Belgium last year, and they looked at me like, well, their pastor only comes through on the third Sunday. That's okay. It's a completely different landscape in Europe. Because of declining churches and all these huge century-old buildings with all this history that are just cavernous and empty, they have to think of a way to revive the community and revive the church through commerce, collaborative income streams to achieve financial stability. And then finally, through compassion. And Hardage redefines compassion, or maybe takes it at what it was always meant to be. Seeks to renew the church's compassion in a way that transforms the community. And they define it as this, that compassion is not saying, they're there. Compassion is not giving away goods to the community. Compassion is partnering with friends to form relationships that release the gifts of strangers. Which brings me to Nehemiah today. We're now about halfway through Nehemiah. Nehemiah 1, we meet Nehemiah pleading to be able to be sent into Jerusalem to do the good work that Nehemiah believes needs to be done to rebuild this church that has taken 50 years of people saying they're going to rebuild it and nothing's yet happened. Nehemiah 2, he comes to Jerusalem and he sees the state of things, that it's way worse than he ever thought it was. The state of Jerusalem, the state of the walls, the state of the people. They're desperate. Everything's in decline. The community the community has followed the path of the destruction of the church and its community. And then in 3 and 4, we begin the work. And in the process, we notice that there's all kinds of people who would rather not see the community be reformed, would rather not see the church be rebuilt. And now today we get to Nehemiah 5. And I want us to read this together. Here's our scripture. Now there was a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish kin. They've been building. For there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters, we are many, we must get grain so that we can eat and stay alive here. There were also those who said, we are having to pledge our fields and our vineyards and our houses in order to get grain during the famine. We're having to borrow money on our fields and vineyards to pay the king's tax. And now our flesh is the same as that of our kindred. Our children are the same as our children, and yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves. And some of our daughters have been ravished, and we are powerless, and our fields and vineyards now belong to each other. That is a sad community. After thinking it over, I contended with the nobles and officials, and I said to them, you are all taking interest from your own people. And I called a great assembly to deal with them, and I said to them, as far as we are able, we have bought back our Jewish kindred who have been sold to other nations, and now you are selling your own kin who must then be bought back by us. They are silent and could not find a word to say, and so I said, the thing that you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations and our enemies? Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. And so let us stop this taking of interest. Restore to them this very day in their fields and their vineyards and their olive orchards and their houses and the interest on money and grain and wine and oil that you have been exacting from them. And then they said, we will restore everything and demand nothing more of them. And I called the priests and I made them take an oath to do as they had promised. And I also shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out everyone from house and from property who does not perform this promise. Thus may they be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, amen. And the people did as they had promised. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year, of the king, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took food and wine from them, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. And indeed, I have devoted myself to the work on the wall and acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for work. Moreover, there were at my table 150 people, Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. Now that which was prepared for one day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowls were prepared for me, and every 10 days skins of wine in abundance. Yet with all this, I did not demand the food allowance of the governor because of the heavy burden of labor on the people. Remember, for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people. Let's take a second and put up, so that you all know where we are in the course of Old Testament history. Let's take a second and figure out where we are in this story. You notice that we are at the end of the Old Testament. Nehemiah is all the way over here. Let's recall all that has happened. Remember that the children were slaves in Egypt before they were slaves in Babylon, and these Jewish people who are coming into town and then being completely taken advantage of, they are coming back from exile in Babylon, but before that they were in exile in Egypt. Those are the ones we know, right? Those are the stories we know with Pharaoh, right? There's 2 parts of this story, Israel and Egypt. They're quite similar, but there is a big difference here between these 2 parts of the story for Israel. Exile in Babylon, and exile in Egypt versus exile in Babylon. There is a big difference. Slavery in Egypt was not Israel's fault. They were hungry. There was a famine. They went into Egypt to find food. They did well there, and they became a threat to the regime in Egypt. And the regime made them slaves to keep them down. And so when we imagine Israel in Egypt, it's easy for us to identify with the oppressed everywhere, the downtrodden, and the abused, and the hurt, and the disenfranchised, and the cruelly treated. And we really like the Egypt story. We read those passages over and over and over again. I imagine you've never read Nehemiah. We like it because it makes us feel righteous in a sense. It tells us, especially this week, that God vindicates in the face of injustice. God sets history straight. But Babylon wasn't like that. The books of Isaiah and Kings and Jeremiah and Lamentations and Ezekiel, all the prophets writing during that time, make no mistake in portraying Israel's time in exile as a suffering and sorrowful time. But the difference is this between them, the time in Babylon, it's kind of self-inflicted. This is suffering that need not have been, but is now. This is suffering that Israel brought on itself. We don't like to read these stories at all because they make us, they don't make us feel righteous. They make us feel guilty. So long as we are trying to relate ourselves to those in exile, and more guilty if we are relating ourselves to the oppressors keeping others in exile. We'd rather take refuge in military and economic and geopolitical explanations for the fall of the Israelite kingdom. But the Bible's having none of it. Israel had made her bed, and she spent 70 years lying in it. I wonder how that touches you today, these two different stories. Thinking about exile in Egypt, and then thinking about these poor people coming back from exile in Babylon. First, I just wonder if there's any suffering and pain in your life that has nothing to do with this week's election. I'm sure there is. Perhaps it was something done to you. Perhaps it was self-inflicted. We spend a lot of time licking the wounds of our slavery in Egypt, resenting the ways the sins of others bring us down and make our lives harder than we feel they should be. But we're in Nehemiah, and so we can't ignore that this is not Egypt. We're talking about Babylon, and we were on a journey. If we were on a journey with a prophet today, we would be maybe at the latter half of Isaiah, the very end of Isaiah. The last chapters, as the people of Israel are kind of like zombies, toddling out of like what has been this shocking and wounding experience, some of whom have been more wounded than others, some of whom who are this kind of zombies walking out of it, trying to make sense of how this happened, some of us knowing full well our part and role within it. For Israel, it's a visible space, right? Babylon, these people are returning from. They're returning from a place. It might be different for us. It may be personal for you. That you know what it means to face deep humiliation or a sense of anguish. You know you didn't do anything to get here. And you're trying to figure out, is there even a side? It may be that every time you see certain people, you blink and you wince because you feel you feel like a sense of judgment, and you feel a sense of like you're not safe. Or maybe you're like Israel, stumbling out of exile, battered and bruised, and you just can't handle more bruising. Or maybe you're the one who remembers how you got in exile in the first place. Maybe you know people, maybe some people who are your closest friends, narrate this story very differently. Wherever you are as you're stumbling out of exile, though, as they were stumbling out of exile, whoever they were, whether they were the rulers who got us in this mess, or they were those who were feeling the real day-to-day fear and anxiety because of it, God had a word for Israel then at the latter half of Isaiah. You might know these words. They come to us in Advent. Well, I have been craving Advent lately. Comfort, comfort, O my people, says your God. God gives us compassion in the way that we would typically expect it. God knows we have no ability to offer compassion ourselves in that moment, and so God just gives us compassion. Comfort, O my people. But when I look closely at these words and what they would have meant for Israel in Babylon, to discover precisely what these words meant, like to imagine yourself in that moment, maybe you feel like you are. Israel has this series of reasons to find God's dazzling new words of comfort hard to swallow. To start with, when you've made a mess of things, when you've sinned big time, there is a lot of hurt, a lot of people who are so deeply hurt, and hurt hurts other people. By hurt, I mean the impact of wrongdoing on hearts and minds and souls, and most of all, on God's heart too. For Israel, the hurt was their estrangement from God. And then there's the damage. The damage was the fact that they were in Babylon 1,000 miles away from home. But look what God does. God said, I'll deal with the hurt, and I'll deal with the damage. Cry to Jerusalem. Cry to Jerusalem 1,000 miles away that she served her term and that her penalty is paid. It's the compassion of God on full display. In other words, her sin is forgiven and its consequences are healed. That's the difference between forgiveness and healing. Forgiveness deals with the sin, but after the sin is forgiven, there's still always the damage to be faced. Healing addresses the damage, and it sometimes takes a whole lot longer. Israel had another obstacle in the way of accepting what was next. Gosh, it was a 30-day journey from home. And in between, there are mountains, and there are valleys, and there are all sorts of difficult terrain. And in other words, they put themselves in such a distant place from God, such a distant place from forgiveness, such a distant place from healing, that there was going to be a lot more work to be done. And this is what God has to say about that distance. The latter half of Isaiah to these people that we meet in Nehemiah today, God says, well, guess what? Every valley will be lifted up, and every mountain and hill will be made low. And the uneven ground, I promise, will become level for you, and the rough places a plain. Don't go worrying about the road back. You know the way. There's an Eastern king. You know, the way an Eastern king travels around the empire, and a herald travels a day or two ahead of him to make sure the road ahead is flat and straight and free of obstacles. You know how that happens? Well, that's the way it will be for me with you. All kinds of other obstacles. Our flesh is weak. We literally can't do it anymore. The distance is so far. And now we've got this third obstacle of my strength is just not up to this anymore. They offer that to God. They say the grass withers and the flower fades. 2 centuries pass from this moment. Another obstacle is added to their path. This one seems the biggest of all now. The consequences of all that's happened. The consequences we can't even imagine. And it seems like they cannot ever get back to Jerusalem. And then, out of nowhere, behold your God. God's closer to you. God begins to describe God's self in the later prophets of Isaiah as a shepherd who loves us like his own sheep. He doesn't drive us faster than we can go. And when the going's really, really rough, he gathers us in, he carries us in his bosom. Behold your God. And finally, they get back to Jerusalem. And they find, guess what? They find even not an exile. There's a whole other world of issues they're going to encounter. They realized that they had been holding hope for this one thing for so long. They had been holding hope to leave Babylon. And what they get is a whole other set of the world's pain. They get there, they can't be fed well enough. It reminds them of famine again back in Egypt. And so it takes a leader. It takes a leader that is someone with spirit, someone who is deeply grounded to see the people's pain, to realize that to invite them into the work that God is doing without tending also to the very real place they're in, well, that would be fruitless in the end. God has been with them through this journey. God offers just real on the kind of compassion we cannot embody ourselves. That kind of, when you've done the worst thing, God says comfort. I know this is hard for you. But Nehemiah knows that there's a different kind of compassion on the horizon. Renewing them in a sort of compassion that is more than they could ever imagine. And so let's put those words again. Nehemiah makes sure that they are fed. Nehemiah gets rid of his own, gives away what he is given by the king to the community. And not only that, it says that Nehemiah also invites not just the Jewish people coming back from exile, but all the world to this table. And so the wall was finished because of that. He renewed the hope of the people, renewed the hope like St. Martin's in the Field, where he began to think of compassion. Compassion is partnering with these friends here to also offer compassion for strangers. And of course, when their enemies heard it again, they riled up to defeat them again. It's going to go on over and over again like that through the rest of Nehemiah. They make progress and they go to be defeated. But what they are building is something that is much like St. Martin's in the Fields. In contrast to fear, what's being built here is a community of hope that is embodying this liberating story of reconciliation and grace. In contrast to exclusion, what Nehemiah is building is this distinctive community and congregation whose life is shaped and renewed through the energy and gifts of all the people. In contrast to despair, faithful people who have discovered how God is made known in times of adversity. Who walks alongside us. In contrast to decline, the city that had been ravished is now being rebuilt with skill and vision and wisdom. In contrast to defensiveness, fertile centers of creative and artistic flourishing will be built out of this new Jerusalem. It's the kind of compassion that is renewed in us, that sends us out, not to offer the kind of compassion only God can offer, which is the kind that shows up and offers us love and forgiveness when we have done the thing, but the kind of compassion that says, if with others I join in this journey, I too can be a part of God's work.